So welcome everyone to today's Ask an Expert session. Our guest is Patrick Daughtry with NielsenIQ, and Patrick is an expert all things data, but more importantly, how to tell your story as a CPG brand using data. One thing that I know running my brand T-Squares in the past is that, data can be kind of interesting when you're looking at sales numbers and velocity numbers, but it can also be challenging to know how to translate that into something that will really move your business forward, how to use that for retailer meetings, how to use that for category reviews and investor meetings. So for today, Patrick's going to give us just a quick overview of kind of the work that he does to set some context. And then we'll open it up to Q&A from our audience. Some of you submitted questions in advance. And so what I'll do is invite you on to ask your question live to Patrick. And then if anyone else has questions as well, feel free to just drop those in the chat. And then I will invite you to come up and ask that question live as well. So Patrick, I'd love for you just to give a quick 2-minute introduction on yourself and the work you do at NielsenIQ and how you help out emerging brands.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Patrick Daughtry. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I've been with NielsenIQ for about 10 years, and my team specializes in helping emerging brands ingest data, teach them how to use it a little bit, start to get them on that pathway, be a resource. So we definitely specialize in those companies that do anywhere between, even pre-startup all the way to about $200 million in in-store sales tends to be where our wheelhouse is. But we really do specialize in, helping those organizations, whether they have executives that come from, big legacy CPG companies like a Kraft or a Pepsi or a Procter and Gamble or whatnot, or just somebody starts their own business and kind of takes it up and knows nothing about data and needs that full introduction and full education. So anywhere from like was referenced, starting to tell that sales story, starting to set your own benchmarks, communicating with investors or buyers, how to start to strategically go after growth and communicate that story is definitely in where we specialize in helping newer brands start to uncover their story through data. So that's what we do.
I love that, Patrick. So when you think about data that's available for emerging food and beverage companies, where does that data usually come from? And then what kind of data is accessible through NielsenIQ's Bizer platform?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we see a lot of clients start. Most of the time when a client's starting out in the space is they'll be heavily reliant on shipment data. Some retailers will allow access to a portal where they're just able to see their own data. But I think a lot of times some of these clients that we work with, as they're just starting out, get really focused on just being able to say how much sales they're doing or how many shipments they're sending out or how many POs they're getting. And they're not focusing enough on the greater picture, not being able to communicate effectively how that growth, whether it be through shipments or new accounts, new doors, how do we start to translate that into a way that we can communicate it in a uniform way across buyers, investors, internal partners, consultants, brokers, things like that. So one of the big areas that we're most known for and has kind of been the bread and butter of the CPG data industry is what we call retail scan data, which is data that comes directly from retail registers. You scan that item across the register at a store. That point of sale system captures that UPC code. It tells us how many units were sold at what price point, at what time period, and that data all gets sent to us where we're able to collect that, organize it, and report out figures for our clients' own brands and their competitor brands within their category, within adjacent categories, to kind of give a very full picture of not just what am I shipping out, but what's actually selling through to the consumer, and where are those pockets of growth, where are those opportunities, where are those gaps that you can help fill, and how do we start to identify some of these key KPIs that an emerging brand needs to stay on track for their growth plans. That's where our Bizer tool can come in and start to really help clients get a very visual way of being able to digest that information in a very easy to digest format as well. So that tends to be where people kind of start off, and then as they evolve, we just kind of start to slowly incorporate a little bit more as the companies grow, as they get more comfortable with the data and their team gets more comfortable with the data. It kind of becomes ingrained in that culture, and you can really start to have much more strategic conversations about your brand, tell your story in a much more effective way.
Perfect. I love that. Opening up to some of our questions, and if you're able to join us up, I believe you had a question asking, as a small brand, what category and customer insights data would a buyer find helpful?
Yeah, so we get this a lot from, especially from some of the emerging brands, is there's this thought that, why would I get the data if the buyers already have it? And what can I show them that they don't already know? And I think there's a bit of a fallacy there. So a lot of um, buyers do have access to some sort of point of sale system, but to pretend that they're actually diving into this data really deep on your brand before you show up is often not the case, especially if you only have a 15-minute meeting or you have something going on. They're not necessarily diving into the data deeply before, surrounding your story, before you dive in. So anything, typically, just to back up a little bit, when some of these really big clients in these categories go in, if you look at your Crafts or your Procter and Gambles or your Cokes or whatever it may be, they get hours often with that buyer where they're presenting heavily, all the different insights that they're seeing, and oftentimes it's going to be tilted towards what that manufacturer wants to show. So whenever you're going in, if you have any different selling points to your brand, or you're going after a specific niche, specific attributes, let's say you make organic muffins or you make gluten-free bread or something like that, and you want to be able to dive in and really highlight a story surrounding all, like, what makes your product unique, what niche does your product fall into, where are those gaps in that assortment that are on the shelf that you fit into. I think there's a lot of buyers that don't truly know their categories necessarily as well as they used to 10 years, 20 years ago, because buyers are getting shifted around categories all the time. You could have a buyer that's buying candy this year, and in a year or two, they'll be buying, personal care. And that's to make everything more data driven. So the culture of CPG has evolved to where a lot of these buyers rely heavily on their manufacturer partners, not only to provide product and to, provide inventory for their sales, but also to be that knowledge resource. Nobody knows your category as well as you do. Nobody knows your story as well as you do. Being able to communicate that story and what exactly is going on, highlight why your product and the different trends that your products are a part of, why they're outperforming, why they belong on the shelf, that always goes very well. And I think, we just had a long conversation a couple weeks ago with a Whole Foods buyer. And one thing that he brought up that was very important, I think, for small brands is a lot of the small brands go in and they're providing data that, it's very heavily, especially up front. Look how great my product tastes or smells or whatever type of product it is. Look how great my packaging is. Look how big my social media following is. But you also have to think there's limited space on that shelf. So if they're putting you on, something either has to come off or they have to create space somewhere. Being able to go in with an active recommendation to say, hey, look at this, 17% of your bread is gluten free. Your competitors across the way they're at 20%. Here's They're outperforming your category. Here's why you need an additional gluten free item on the shelf, and take away one of these, white bread items or something like that. Having that specific recommendation, having a view into what that buyer is being graded on essentially, and help keeping in that mindset that you're there to basically help that buyer outperform the rest of their market, that really can start to transform that conversation that you're having with that buyer to make it much more strategic, help them visualize what's going on the shelf and how you specifically fit in there. And that is what is going to take away some of that risk aversion that a lot of these buyers, not all, but many who aren't as knowledgeable on their category, help ease that risk aversion to give you a shot on the shelf.
I love that answer, Patrick. And I think it brought up, one of the things that category managers and buyers are looking at, right? The assortment of their shelf. What other data points are really key to telling that story? Things like, is it velocity? Is it really looking at like your product velocity? Is it looking at the category as a whole and that growth, right? If a new brand only has 10 to 30 minutes, kind of what are those key data points that are going to really be strong?
Yeah, velocity is king, especially for small or emerging brands, especially because that's usually when you have a really good story to tell. When you're in a more specialized store that, where your product's going to move much faster, being able to tell that velocity short story and show how your product is moving faster than your competitors, showing that growth rate when you have it as you're kind of rising up and you have those big growth rates because you're going from nothing to something. But even as you're a little bit more established, really focusing in on that velocity and how it's comparing to your competitors. But another thing to also keep in mind is that we also really want to be paying attention to not just how you're performing, but how it's performing relative to a benchmark out there. So if you have a meeting with Publix, for example, going in and saying, look, my velocity is best in class at this store, but we also have to keep in mind, like, what is that environment that Publix category is within, and who are they competing against? Going in saying, I'm up 10%, my velocity is up 13%, I'm able to take price effectively and not show a slowdown. But then you have to take that in context of what's going on within Publix's remaining market and within the Publix store themselves to be able to really tell a compelling story. Because you could be up 10%, but what if Publix's shelf is actually up 15 and you'd actually be underperforming there? Or that velocity might be down a little bit. But I would definitely focus heavily on velocity. Right now, a really big one is like looking at unit volumes. Unit volumes are soft everywhere right now, not everywhere, but most places. So we see a lot of high dollar, or not high dollar growth, but we're seeing dollar growth everywhere. But if you're able to tell that story, especially from a unit perspective, that you're moving units and you're growing that unit volume, that will be very powerful to a lot of buyers. And then being able to show, especially if you have those different unique pieces, especially a lot of the emerging brands have a very powerful story to tell in many cases. Having that story backed up with data that proves that it outperforms and that it fits is just as important as those velocity figures. You have to think about the incrementality of the category. How, is my product actually going to add incremental? Am I just stealing revenue from other, cannibalizing revenue from other brands on the shelf? Being able to take all these different puzzle pieces and put them together into a one holistic story. My velocity is great. I'm growing. I'm able to, I have a great price point that's not, stealing anything from private label. And I have a unique value proposition that fits within to the consumer, that fits in the shelf and adds incremental volume, is all really big in terms of gaining successful distribution with data.
Great points. Samantha, do you want to come up and ask your question?
Yeah, actually, so my question was really similar to what you just asked. Like it was basically, what are some other important KPIs besides velocity? So I guess I would want a little bit more background on like putting your numbers into context. Because I really liked what you said about understanding, well, what is the store trending and what's your trend compared to that? So like in terms of like the store and even like the geographic location of the store, what's some data points that you could add for more context
And I
for
think
your own?
Patrick as well is how that the data collection changes as you kind of grow from that early startup stage to growth.
Yeah. So I think, to answer the first portion, I think it's a lot of based around like the market context. When we look at scan data or data, there's like four essential pieces. There's what market we're looking at, what products we're looking at, what time periods, what metrics. I think the key metrics and being able to tell that story about that, are you promoting effectively, or is your price point right, your unit volume, your velocities, things like that are all part of that metrics piece. I think having the context of being able to tell that story and see that data across different markets and platforms. So if you are a regional brand and you're looking to expand out, being able to draw those parallels using the same metrics, but looking at it across, those remaining markets. I think it's like a very underutilized way of analyzing data for a lot of newer brands, is they're not looking at those remaining markets well enough, or at least comparing it against a total, like a total US or a total region that player is playing in. Same metrics, but using it over that region, I think, is very important, to be able to make sure that you're really put yourself in your buyer's shoes and think of that report card, which is their category growth compared to that rest of the market. Anything that you can do that shows that growth is going to be important. But there's a lot of tools that we can get into that will be much more impactful. Like we could do official assortment studies that will basically provide an actual figure for what that lift will be if you get on the shelf, and how it will impact the other brands around you. But that tends to be one of those more pieces as you kind of get your feet wet with the scan data. You move into some panel data and start looking at who is my demographic, and how does the shopper of my product gel with these different retailers that I'm getting into, or is there opportunity because I'm missing a big portion of who I think my target consumer should be, in this specific retailer A, B, or C is a great fit and would add these additional consumer groups that I'm missing that I think would resonate well with my product. There's a lot of different pieces that you can start, and that puzzle gets more complex as you grow and get bigger. So as but I think I think it's very critical that companies that are in that emerging space start to walk before you run a little bit, just because the data can be, a lot of times companies will have like one person that's really doing the heavy analysis, and that data stays very siloed with them. They'll use it in like a board meeting or a board review to explain to everybody what's going on, or to set those benchmarks or whatever it may be. But then as we kind of layer on some of those more complex, more in-depth studies, it kind of falls off with the rest of the team. So being able to start to integrate that data, not only with your salespeople who are making those pitches to buyers, but also with the marketing teams, also with the CFO or production, to be able to start to forecast how much product they need to be able to make, or what that manufacturing capacity is, or shipping rates, things like that, because of anticipated POs. There's a lot of different things that we can start to use this data across the organization that then allows you to kind of take those further steps that allow you to integrate the data across all the functions within your organization or within your brand. So to recap that, I know that was kind of a complex answer. I think there are a lot of different metrics that we can share that would be kind of unique to what your story is and what your data is showing. I think that velocity piece is king, and being able to show it not only across the markets that you're already in, but be able to compare that across some of those markets you're going to be going into, having the data for those specific trends and making sure that you're on trend, and highlight those different pieces that make your brand unique, that are unique to your selling story, and being able to show how that works, or where those gaps are in that retailer that you're trying to sell into versus the rest of the market, or across a total marketplace. Showing that your price point is right, showing that you're going to be promoting or have promotional support, and that it's effective, and that it's strategic. And then you can start to tie in some of those consumer demographics and start to show, here's who my consumer is, and here's why this is a great fit with you as a retailer. And this is kind of as you start to get bigger and you grow a little bit more, and your organization becomes more comfortable, you start to take a look at that leakage and be able to go into a retailer and say, look, X% of your shoppers are buying my product over here. Here's why you need to put me on the shelf. Here's where what my trial and repeats look like when I get brand new distribution on the shelf. All this type of information kind of starts to flow together as you start to grow.
Awesome. Love all those, Patrick, and thanks for the questions, Samantha. Just wanted to send a reminder to everyone, if you have any general questions or specific questions, feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll make sure to answer those. So Anne has a question. She asks, as a pre-product brand, how do I estimate competitor sales and market share? And I'll add to that, are there specific Visor reports that can lay out that information that she should be aware of?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this actually kind of feeds into a bit of a broader tactical way to use data a little bit. So we have a lot of resources where you can just buy a one-time report. It can be very inexpensive. where you can start to get that lay of the land. And I think that's a very critical thing for new brands to do, to really understand who those players are and what the marketplace looks like for that category. Get those category dynamics, understand, take your brand out of it for a second and make sure that you really understand the trends that are taking place within a category before you even start to dive into your own. It's very difficult to tell a story about why your brand is going to work, why it's going to be successful on the shelf, if you don't understand that those category dynamics that are already happening and that have happened in the past. So we can always provide a one-time snapshot that just basically shows, here's your category, here's every single player in it, and here's how much dollar volume they do, here's what their distribution levels look like, here's what their 17 or 20% of their sales are on promotion, and this is the type of promotion they're on. And you can start to really gauge what that looks like, what market shares are there, what retailers are big for this type of product. And you can start to kind of figure out where that fit is, uncover who those new and upcoming brands are, identify, what those trends are in terms of different product attributes. Is gluten-free or organic or, clean label a big trend here? Again, keeping in mind what is part of your story, because the whole purpose of this is to tell a story that has that fact-based, data-driven narrative behind it. But how do we start to uncover all those different pieces so that when we do finally start to dive into our brand and tell our story, we know whether it's on trend or not, we know if it's outperforming or not, we know what the different pieces to push, what buttons to push to really get that buyer excited about showing why you're going to be successful on the shelf. And I think we get a lot of feedback from brands that are like, oh, I'm too small, I don't have any sales yet. But I think we have to keep in mind, data isn't just to be like, look at how well I'm doing. That's in fact, that may be about 50% of the goal of it. A bigger goal that I think a lot of people, or that we're trying to kind of really start to shift people's mindset on a little bit, is to use this data more proactively. It's just as important to show that you're a good fit and that you're on trend or you're ahead of trend or whatever the case may be, than just showing, look how well I'm doing in my select number of retailers that I'm in. Because that's no guarantee that you're going to do well. If you could be doing great in a handful of retailers that are over in this area, that buyer is not going to is still going to have that risk aversion there unless you really blow them away with your story, unless you can prove that fit is there. And that's partly why our Advisor platform does make every retailer available to you. Like, if you were to, not to go into a sales pitch, but it's kind of the theory behind why we build this stuff the way that we do, is we want to help these brands start to use this data more proactively, the same way that these big brands do, identifying those gaps of opportunity, identifying where we can start to really make an impact on the category's incrementality is big. So as a pre-brand, it is very important to get that lay of the land, understand, where everything is, what the category dynamics look like, look what that market, how fragmented is that market? Are there a bunch of different brands? Is it a bunch of small brands making it up? Is it dominated by 3 big players? And then there's a bunch of, smaller folks in there. Having that view, not only from a category brand perspective, but also a retail perspective, a geography perspective. Where are these trends taking off? Where is this received? Who is the consumer? And I don't think it all necessarily has to come from buying data. I think there's some areas where you can get that information just by going to a store and checking things out and starting to get a feel for it that way. And then when you get that light bulb moment and think, oh, I fit here, that's when you can come to us and we can really help you drill down to the specifics of that argument. Even if you just, you're putting one slide together to show that investor so that you can start that brand up because you're pre-launch and you just need that hard-hitting fact, you can come to us. We can get, you have that hypothesis, say, hey, can I get just a brief thing on these 3 brands? I just want to see, how this brand evolved over the past 5 years. We can do something like that very easily on a very ad hoc basis where it doesn't involve some big, subscription all the time. It can be very, if you have that one little piece, you really just need to provide that meaty tidbit for that presentation. We can help you with that too.
Awesome. I love that, Patrick. And I want to use this halfway point to really highlight our partnership with NielsenIQ, because they're offering everyone in the food beverage community, including everyone on this webinar, 3 free reports to actually pull to see how your category and brands are performing. So if your brand's in market and showing up in the data, then you can actually see what your performance looks like. And even if you're pre-market, you can use these 3 free reports to see how the category is performing, so that you can use those for your buyer meetings, for investor meetings. And the link is in the chat, so feel free to save that, and we'll also send that out as a follow-up. The other thing I'll highlight is using that link as well. You can actually sign up for a one-on-one call with the NielsenIQ team to ask specific questions and saying, hey, I want to tell a story around, just use your example earlier, like why my gluten-free bread should be an X retailer. And then the team can really help you figure out, hey, here's the data to look at to help you tell that story, right? Because if your first time using data, it can be a little overwhelming to like know how to pull the report, which retailers, which regions, all of those things. And so the NielsenIQ team is really making themselves available to make sure you're getting actionable information to tell your story and not just getting lost in data. So definitely be sure to take care of that. The other call out that I want to say that's interesting as well is, and Patrick, interesting to hear your thoughts on this with data, right? Like it's a number. If you look at how, let's say you're looking at a new retailer and they have no gluten-free breads there. Does that mean you should launch in that retailer because there's a white space, or that you shouldn't because that retailer isn't supporting that category? Maybe those customers aren't shopping there at the store looking for it. And so it's really all around like how you kind of tell and craft that story and do more research. So do you have any examples of, just from your experience, like how you've been able to leverage different data points to really share stories around like when you should launch into a new retailer or a new kind of distribution?
Yeah, I think those types of challenges are unique, and don't, you know, I don't think you'll ton of retailers that don't have gluten-free bread, but a lot of brands that will come to us and say, "There's nothing like this in the market, doesn't exist." Like, how do we start to create a story that there should be something here, or that we deserve that distribution? And I think this is where having, if you're in that type of position where you're going to a category established or doesn't have anything that's similar there, is then we have to kind of look broader to be able to get that shows that this is a unique fit. So an example that we have that we could do is we have a panel, use the gluten-free bread.
Oh, unfortunately, it looks like there you're back, Patrick.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you
Nope,
hear
no
me?
worries.
Okay?
Yep, you're good now.
So what I was getting to is we have a lot of different tools that can help tell that story. So in the example that you gave with gluten-free bread, if there's a store that doesn't have any, we have a panel where we are able to measure ailments. And we can measure a lot more than just ailments. We can measure a lot of different things, where we could take a look at anybody who has gluten intolerance and show that retailer, look at how many people who have gluten intolerance are shopping at your store. Like, and you don't have any options for them, so they're buying apples and bananas at your store, but then they're leaving to go to another store to buy something else, when you could be capturing that you could be converting that shopper into that category. You could be bringing new shoppers into this category, and you're missing out on that because you don't have this option. There's things like that we can do, but more specifically, I think if you don't want to go that route, and keep it really simple, it could just be as simple as doing the same thing that we were just kind of discussing, is looking at what's happening at stores around that market or around that retailer, seeing how's gluten-free bread performing there, and is there actually incrementality there. I think there's an example that we use a lot, with chocolate milk. And you think about, a retailer has a big case of milk, and then they'll have like 1 or 2 or a couple chocolate milk SKUs, but every data report in the world will show that white milk is outperforming chocolate milk, just because people are buying white milk all the time. So we have to think not just in terms of, is my product selling higher dollars than something else, or is it, you know, moving faster, have a higher velocity? We also have to keep in mind that other part of the story of that incrementality, and think that white milk shopper, like chocolate milk isn't taking away from a white milk shopper. It's purely additive. It's capturing a purchase that wouldn't happen otherwise. That's where we can start to also tell that story with a lot of products that emerging brands have that are innovative, that might not like directly compete with something that's exactly the same, but you're still can make space on the shelf, even if you're not outperforming somebody else, because it's a purely incremental spend. We can help measure that incrementality or start to do some modeling to show that as well. But another way, even outside of that, is just to see how's gluten-free bread performing in the rest of the market within that same retailer's footprint, but you know, outside of that retailer, and start to say, hey, look, this is bringing in X number of dollars outside. Here's why you know, give us a test run. It's like there's a or start to understand why they don't have gluten-free bread. But that usually, those are three ways that we could approach it pretty easily, indirectly.
Patrick, when looking at promotions, I know a lot of brands are investing in trade spend and they're trying to figure out, was this promotion effective or not? And so how do you think about using data to measure things like the, lift in sales during a promotion and sustained lift after?
Yeah, and we have a lot of tools that help you do this really effectively. Basically, we're able to create, using the category as a whole and also using your brand's historical performance, we're able to create a baseline based on all these different variables that are going on. Like, what would you be selling absent any type of promotion? That's when you hear about base metrics, you hear base dollars or base units. And it's an algorithm that runs that basically says, absent any promotion, here's what we would expect you to sell based off what everybody else is doing, and based on all of those other variables, like anybody else that's promoting, or if there's a Super Bowl and you're in hot dogs or something, and naturally you see a lift there even without promotion. We're able to then layer the actual sales during that promoted period over that baseline to be able to create that lift, or not create that lift, to be able to measure that lift. And then we can also you could cross-reference that with your cost of that promotion to be able to see how effective was it. And that's kind of how we would measure it. But then we also have tools that can go really deep into basically identifying those trends over time. Like, let's say break it down every single week over the last year, uncover that seasonality of the category, uncover the different trends within that category and how these different brands are evolving. And we can actually tell you specifically which, like, 2 or 3 weeks out of the year are the best ones to promote. Where we're able to isolate that using some of these very complex models that we build. It's the same models that your Procter and Gamble's and your Coca-Colas and Tyson's and everybody uses, but it's kind of in a way that's very easily digestible to be able to show you, here are the different types of promotion we're measuring, whether it be a feature ad or a display or a temporary price reduction. We're able to measure those lifts and how effective they have been on the category in the past. And then we're able to take a look at those category dynamics and say, here's where this would be most effective based off of, historical data and what we model into the future. So there's a lot of different ways that we can measure it, and we'll be able to also take a look at that promotional behavior across those different promotional types and tell you what types of promotion are best. Or you could even, if you don't want us to tell you which one's best and you just want to see the measurement of it, we can do that. We can take a 7-week period before the promotion, a 7-week period during the promotion, a 7-week after, and be able to show you kind of what that looks like, and then go back a couple of years and you're able to see very easily what that lift would be if you don't want to use the metrics that specifically highlight it. But we have all the tools to help you really dive deep into that, and to be able to start to negotiate a little bit more with those retailers in terms of what is that best promotional strategy. And that is super important, especially now, because we've been seeing this inflation kick up and the price sensitivity so high. We've been seeing promotional effectiveness jump through the roof over the past few months, where those promotions are seeing extra amount of effectiveness over the past few months than they have in the past, because of how sensitive consumers are about price at the moment.
That's awesome. Appreciate that. One thing that founders ask me is like, how often should I be looking at data, and how do I kind of build that into my strategic planning? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so that would depend on where you're at in your business cycle. I think if you're a brand that's just starting out, you're pre-launch or you just launched, I I think it's often best, especially if you don't have a team that's really savvy with data, to kind of take it in slow right off the bat. Meaning you have a meeting coming up and you're like, oh, I really want to get into this retailer. I'm meeting with them at a trade show, or I was able to get this meeting. We can get you that one-time snapshot to help you prove internally that ROI, so you can see with your own two eyes how much that data will transform that conversation, and just have, you know, 1 to 3 slides of your presentation deck that highlights some of those key data points and where you fit in, and highlight some of those trends. As that starts to come into play and you start to, gain some more retailers that are carrying your product, then you can kind of start to expand a little bit more and make sure you're getting this data every quarter or every month, to make sure that you're always ready for those line reviews. Make sure that you can stay in on top of what those trends are. You're not surprised, but if you go into that line review and you hear a buyer say, oh, you're not performing too well, you're at risk of being, delisted. Being able to stay on top of that stuff every month, every quarter is kind of that next step. And then once we kind of are at that step where you're measuring those core retailers, you're getting some data periodically for those big meetings that you have where you don't have distribution, you're trying to gain distribution. Then it kind of evolves into, okay, I need an ongoing subscription that I have that flexibility to pull different retailers in when I need to, that I can pull data more frequently, that I can, use this data internally to start to strategize much more deeply on all these different elements. We don't, to your point earlier, Jordan, I think this data can be very intimidating to a lot of brands that are starting to grow. So dumping everything on yourself right now, and especially if you're limited on time or you don't have an analyst, we tend to recommend that you start to take it a little slow, start to get your feet wet with it, start to communicate this data internally and get other people's eyes on it. And then it becomes much easier to adopt once it becomes part of that culture of your business, to be able to, have those sales meetings where you're benchmarking your growth using percent ACV instead of just door count. And you're starting to be able to target consumers more specifically using some of our panel data, then it becomes much easier to really ramp it up and not just be burdened by a bunch of data sitting on your desk, or technically on your computer, that you might not have the time to dive into as much as you thought you would. So starting slow, starting just getting 1 to 3 slides with some stuff on your in your presentation, seeing how that works and kind of tweaking your strategy from there, which we can always help you with. We're here to advise you if you have any questions on how to use that, how to analyze the data, how to dig in deeper. And if a buyer's challenging you on something, how do I respond? We can help provide the data to do that and give you some pointers on how we would address it. And then you can kind of just grow it from there.
I know in the past data's been really expensive. And so, what does data look like in terms of, and like, how does it change in terms of affordability, so that founders can actually take advantage of it? I know I mentioned earlier, we have our 3 free Nielsen reports, but then like, what is kind of, how much should brands be kind of paying for data if you're, say, under $1 million in sales?
I mean, it can be pretty affordable nowadays. So I do think, part of the reason we launched this Pfizer platform was to make data more available to emerging brands and make sure that you have the tools to compete effectively. And it's a model that's built to grow with you. So the size or how much revenue you're doing in the marketplace is arguably like the biggest factor in terms of what that cost will be. So we can give you a full subscription that you have access to all of our retailers, and you can pull data 10 times a month, and you could be paying $12,000 a year if you need that full package. But if you're just looking to start out and you're even before that stage of having that ongoing data at your fingertips all the time, it can be as little as $1,000. It can be $500 if you just need a tidbit or two. It can also be $2,000 if you need, like, show me this whole retailer and show me every single item in the category across all these time periods. And it can be somewhere around that ballpark. There's definitely efficiency when you know you need it, ongoing, because then you get a lot more for your money. But having that quick hit that you can see that ROI on tends to be important. Helping you see how that transforms the conversation can move things pretty effectively for you. And we can always work with you. You know, we're not here to nickel and dime you or to put something really big and expensive in your hands if you're not ready for it. So I would just be upfront with what you're looking at, and we can always make something work to get some data in your hands. We release thought leadership all the time too, and these free reports hopefully will start to get your feet wet a little bit, but there's definitely a lot of affordable options there, especially built for emerging brands to be successful.
Awesome. So we're coming up towards the end of our session today. So if anyone else has any last questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, and I can make sure to ask those to Patrick. Patrick, any other kind of major problems that you see in terms of like brands using data incorrectly, or just like issues that they have that are preventing them from using data as they should be, or common mistakes?
I think a really big one that we see a lot is even after people buy data and fully realize a lot of clients have limited time. Like you could just be a founder, but you don't have that analyst, you don't have folks, and you get data for the first time and you realize, oh shoot, I haven't had time to do anything with this. I'm just going to take a snapshot, show what number I am in a category, post that on a slide, and that's it. And I think, you know, we can help make some of this insight really jump out at you so you don't have to do a bunch of analysis. And I think being able to dive deeper into some of these different metrics, even if and it can take a second, just changing the way that you're speaking about your distribution levels is a key example. A lot of small companies or emerging brands will really focus on door count. So I'm in 300 doors, I'm in 400 doors, and my goal is to get 500 more doors over the next year. But that's a metric that is wildly subjective to a point from a revenue perspective, because every door is not created equal. By starting to use some of this data, and this especially goes towards like working with investors, things like that, and being able to set benchmarks in your team that are directly tied more specifically to what we can expect from a revenue perspective, or from, you know, that money coming in sales perspective, is very important to be able to take a look at more of that, you know, percent ACV methodology, where it's a weighted distribution metric that takes into account the volume that a store does, allows you to tie everything in much more specifically, where instead of just saying I'm in 300 doors, you could say, oh, I have, you know, 3% ACV, and for every 1 percentage point of ACV, I'm bringing in X number of dollars. I can now directly tie that to, you know, if I want to gain 1% more ACV next year, I know essentially how much revenue is going to be coming in. Where 10 doors at Walgreens are not the same as 10 doors at Whole Foods, are not the same as 10 doors at Walmart. And that becomes much more difficult to kind of draw those correlations. So by starting to create some of those benchmarks and some of those growth strategies using the data, will help you tremendously when you are communicating to those investors, when you're able to start to strategize on a much deeper level. And you could even say, hey, I want to gain X number more sales next year. Oh, well, based on the data and based off what our velocity is looking at, we need to gain X% more ACV. How many, you know, if I go into Publix, does that do it? If I go into Target, does that do it? You know, we can start to really strategize in a way that directly correlates those dollars to that distribution level, and helps you stay on the same page with those investors, and be able to have those investors take a look at what you're doing, and have that growth plan be much more predictable, and then be able to see other brands as they're growing and benchmark yourself against those growth paths as well. Same with share, like looking at your share of the market and being able to have goals against, you know, a true dollar and unit share. There's a bunch of different benchmarks that you can start to set for yourself that really help you up that strategic aspect of your business, and help you communicate it much more broadly and make sure that you're all on the same page. I mean, the last thing an investor wants to see is if you're saying, hey, I have 500 stores, well, let's get 200 more, but then the 200 stores you get aren't anywhere in the same ballpark as the ones you already had, and it just doesn't correlate to the sales, and sales still aren't meeting those targets, but maybe those distribution doors are. So there's a lot of stuff like that I think is something that a lot of clients are missing, and really can help even when communicating with retailers, really help you dive into that next level.
All super helpful. Patrick, thank you so much for joining today and sharing all these questions or all your answers. One thing I wanted just to re-highlight is make sure you click on the link that's in the chat and sign up for your free three reports with NielsenIQ's Visor platform. Even if you're like not sure exactly what you need right now, I recommend setting up a call with their team so you can talk through what your issues are, and then they can help direct you to the data that will be most helpful for you. This is also that you can have the tools and resources to be empowered so that you can face the challenge that is retail right now and go in with your eyes wide open into how to succeed and how to grow your brand. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining today. We will be sending out a recording after the session in the next day or two, and to follow up with that link as well. And Patrick's email is in the chat as well if you have any questions on anything they said today or would like to follow up. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.